Good afternoon. On behalf of the Islesboro Forum Committee, welcome to the 5th program of the 2020 Islesboro Forum Speaker Series. I'm Gail Jackson, and I'll be your moderator for the session today. Before we jump into today's program, I am pleased to share the news that our committee met this week and decided to go ahead with planning for a Forum Speaker Series in the summer of 2021. Please help us think ahead to 2021. We invite you to go to the islesboroforum.org website and give us your ideas for speakers. I assure you we will listen. And while you're there, please look for and hit the donate button. Help us pay for this summer's forum and make a 2021 forum possible by offering your support with a contribution of as little as $25 or more. I want to acknowledge and thank the 7 other committee members for their terrific support and ideas. Their names are listed on the website. Finally, I acknowledge our technical producer, Michael Hutcherson, who makes the delivery of these programs possible. Now, just a quick reminder as to our format. Once our speaker has completed her remarks, we will have time for Q&A. Look for the Q&A function at the bottom right of your Zoom webinar screen. Type in your question and the moderator will pose it in the order received to the speaker. And now I will ask Peter Rothschild to introduce our speaker, who comes to us from Portland, Maine today. Peter is an Islesboro resident, the Chief Investment Officer of the Maine Community Foundation, on the board of the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, and a longtime supporter of Bigelow Laboratories. Peter, over to you.
Thanks, Gail. Hi, all. A brief introduction. Several years ago, I read Jeffrey Bolster's book, The Mortal Sea. I highly recommend it to all. Previously, believe it or not, this was several years ago, I had not recognized my profound ignorance about the biology of the ocean's ecosystem, thinking, as many did, that human impact ended at the shore. The scientists at Bigelow Lab for Ocean Sciences, located in Booth Bay, of course, knew infinitely more. Founded in 1974, an offshoot of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, Bigelow's mission is to understand the ocean's microbial engine as a way to inspire and inform responsible use of the ocean, drive technological advances, and help all life on the planet thrive. Bigelow today includes over 80 scientists and staff. Our speaker, Dr. Beth Orcutt, is a senior research scientist at Bigelow, where, in her own words, she leads a team to study the weird microscopic life that lives at the bottom of the ocean. As you will hear, not only is this subject not nearly as so esoteric as I originally thought, but Beth's research is particularly relevant to the many extraordinary challenges human survival faces today. Viral pandemics, climate change, and global ecological health. In addition to her impressive academic and postdoctoral accomplishments, her research has taken her to the bottom of remote oceans, the Canadian Arctic, oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, and elsewhere around the world. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Orcutt.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Hopefully we get all this technology to work. Give me one moment, everyone. So it's my pleasure to be here as a speaker for the forum. And thank you so much, Gail and Peter and Michael, for helping me to speak with you all today about how my research connects to the impacts that humanity might place on the seafloor through the lens of an emerging industry called deep sea mining. And so before I get started, I want to just give a little bit more background about what Bigelow Laboratory is for folks who may not be familiar with our institution. So Bigelow Laboratory, as Peter mentioned, is on the East Boothbay shoreline, and we recently went through a new strategic visioning process and updated our mission actually from what Peter mentioned. But really the concept of the scientists at Bigelow is really to propose bold science to find solutions for the blue planet that we all live on. And I welcome you to ask any questions about Bigelow that you might have towards the end. And so, as I mentioned, our blue planet, right? This is kind of the space view of the Earth that we live on, which is covered, 70% of Earth's surface is covered with ocean. And we have these amazing maps, satellite imagery from all of the different instruments that float above Earth and Earth's orbit. And we have amazing views of land and life on land, and can think about where impacts might be and follow them with satellite imagery. But we actually have a very poor idea of what our own seafloor is like. We have better pictures of Mars, better maps of Mars than we do of 70% of Earth, if you remove the water. And so I have, throughout my talk, I'm gonna put in a couple questions. You don't need to do anything. This is more just a thought exercise for you. If you wanna get out a piece of paper to kind of keep track, you're welcome to do that. So my first question to you is, how much of our seafloor do you think has been mapped at high resolution? So using most modern techniques to give us a good view of what our seafloor looks like. And I put 4 options here. Do you think it's just 10%? Do you think it's 20%? Do you think it's 60%? And do you think we already have like 90% of our seafloor mapped? So go ahead and write down your own answer. And the result is B. Only 20% of Earth's seafloor has been mapped at high resolution, so that you could see features at a similar resolution that you could see with satellite imagery of Earth's land surface. And there's actually quite a big initiative, an international initiative to improve that. It's a program called Seabed 2030 that aims to bring together government agencies, philanthropic groups that are interested in ocean exploration, as well as private boat owners who might be able to help with this initiative to try to map our seafloor. And this is really exciting for me because there are so many different habitats on Earth's seafloor. So this is a kind of a conceptual map of what our seafloor looks like if you were to remove all the water in between land. And so you can see these really interesting features that move through the seafloor, like the mid-ocean ridge system, which you can see in the Atlantic Ocean, right? So that's an area where 2 plates, Earth tectonic plates, are moving apart and creating new seafloor. And so you have these underwater mountains, underwater volcanoes, underwater hydrothermal vents that align along that ridge system. You can see it goes all the way through the Atlantic. There's also a ridge system in the Eastern Pacific Ocean. And you can also see in the Pacific that it's kind of really lumpy looking. Those are what are called seamounts that have formed long ago in Earth's past. And so as those plates age and move, they also subduct underneath other plates. And so that's happening, for instance, in the western rim of the Pacific, and why there's so many volcanoes over there, as well as on our own US coast, off the West Coast, Washington, Oregon, and California, as well as Canada, where you have ocean plates that are subducting underneath the North American plate and generating volcanoes. So there's a lot of different types of habitat down there. But humans have actually only seen a very small fraction of that with cameras or with our own eyes. So this is a picture of kind of the workhorse submersible in the US academic fleet. This is the Alvin submersible from Woods Hole Oceanographic. I've had the pleasure of going down in the Alvin a few times to visit the seafloor. And pretty much every time that scientists go to the bottom of the ocean, as well as private individuals who have financed their own submersibles to go to the depths of the ocean, right? Every time we go down, we find new things. We find new species. We find new behaviors that we weren't anticipating. So there's a lot left to explore. And as one example of that, I'd like to show you a short video that some colleagues of mine collected of what are called black smokers. So these are hydrothermal vents that are at those mid-ocean ridge systems. You have superheated water coming out of the seafloor. That water has lots of metal dissolved in it, and there are microorganisms that can use that metal to gain energy, and they support the basis of these very diverse and unique ecosystems. So you just saw some pictures of all these shrimp, right? They eat some of those organisms. So really strange and fascinating environments on the seafloor. The work in my lab at Bigelow Laboratory focuses on understanding not just the microbes that live in that hot water, but also the microbes that live on the rocks themselves at the bottom of the ocean. So this is a picture of a submersible that's picked up a piece of seafloor basalt. Basalt is kind of like lava on a volcano on land. And those rocks have lots of iron in them. And there are organisms that can use that iron in combination with oxygen to create a chemical reaction that can fuel their growth. And they produce rust as a byproduct. So you can actually see some of those little rust particles in and on the rock. And so my lab uses a combination of geology and microbiology techniques to study those. Here's one example. So at Bigelow, we have some really high-powered microscopes to image each of these microbes. So each one of these kind of little noodle-shaped microbes that you see in this picture is only about 1 micron long. So that's about 1/1000th the width of your hair, just to give you an idea of how tiny these are. But they perform amazing reactions that we want to understand how they survive in these deep sea ecosystems. One of the ways that we do that is at the Bigelow Lab using some of our facilities. So before COVID and wearing face masks was really fashionable, we would do that at our laboratories at Bigelow because we want to make sure that none of the microbes that live on our bodies contaminate our samples. We're trying to sort out individual cells from our samples to investigate the DNA in those cells to figure out what all those microbes can do. And this may seem like an esoteric quest, but one of the reasons we're looking at this so intensely is that microbes that can live on rocks at the bottom of the ocean might be able to perform reactions that are similar to what are predicted to occur on other planetary bodies in our own solar system. So for instance, Europa, which is a moon of Jupiter, and Enceladus, which is a moon of Saturn, both are predicted to have salty oceans in contact with rocky inner layers. And so the same types of reactions that occur at the bottom of our own ocean could be occurring in those places. And so by studying the microbes and how they survive in these weird environments on Earth can help us think about how we might find life elsewhere in the universe. That's really how I got to be a scientist. I'd love to answer any questions you might have about this field of astrobiology, and I want to acknowledge that NASA funds some of this work. So I want to switch gears a little bit here because I don't actually want to talk a lot about the science that I'm doing. I want to talk about how it connects to our lived life on land and how humanity interacts with our seafloor. So I picked a picture of one of the octopus that we have found at some of our study sites and asked the question, like, why should you care about any of these rocks on the bottom of the ocean? And if you see there, the octopus tentacle is kind of close to a kind of a lumpy looking rock. And just to give you a sense of scale, there's a dive weight in there that you would put on a dive belt if you were scuba diving. That octopus is probably the size of my fists. So just to give you kind of a context for what you're looking at here. Okay, so why should you care about these rocks? Well, these rocks contain metals. And some economic geologists actually think of them like ores that you would try to mine on land. So it may not seem like this is a really high percentage of some of these metals like cobalt or copper or nickel. These percentages are actually economically relevant for thinking about where there is pools of these critical metals. And why is there so much interest in these metals? Well, you may know, right? So our lived life on land, there's increasing numbers of wind turbines, solar panels. We've all are using computers and smartphones these days. And there's an increasing number of electric vehicles on the road. All of these technologies require these metals to work. And so I just want to focus on kind of the growth of this for a little bit. So here's a projection that was put together for Bloomberg of the anticipated growth in the use of lithium-ion batteries over the next 5 to 10 years. And you can see the different categories of what type of consumer electronics would be the major growth areas. And so, for instance, there's a projection that there's going to be many, many more electric cars on the road, as well as other types of electronics that use these batteries. And lithium-ion batteries aren't just lithium. They contain a lot of these other metals. So here's an example from about a year or two ago of some of the other metals that are in these lithium-ion alloys. So for instance, a Tesla electric vehicle has aluminum, it has cobalt, and it has nickel as part of the lithium-ion battery chemistry. Your smartphone has quite a bit of cobalt in it as well, in the lithium-ion battery. And folks that are using solar panels, et cetera, and they want to be able to store energy on site, and they might install a power wall or something like that, those also contain some of these metals. So here's the next survey question for you. How many pounds of cobalt do you think are in the average battery for an electric car? And this is based on battery chemistry for the last couple of years. So you think it's like 0.4 to 1 pound, 2 to 3 pounds, or 4 to 17 pounds. So kind of some different scales. Think about it in a minute, like how heavy do you think a battery is and how much of that do you think is cobalt? So the answer is C. The average electric vehicle battery using current battery chemistry is about 4 to 17 pounds. And this represents a very large fraction of the global usage of this metal. And so there's quite a lot of economic incentive right now to try to find the best ore bodies for collecting cobalt and some of these other metals and rare earth elements, et cetera. And so, looking on land, where are the best ore deposits for those, but also considering looking in the sea. When I was a graduate student, and I'm not going to tell you how long ago that was, this idea that we might mine the seafloor for metals was kind of presented as kind of like a sci-fi thing. Like somebody was interested in it, but the economics didn't make sense. Well, that has really changed in the last 5 to 10 years. So there are definitely many countries, many companies, and contractors who are working in this area to design mining machines, to explore parts of the seafloor, to find these metals, and to seek investment for building up this capacity. So I want to walk you through where this might be happening in our ocean over the next few years. So here's a map of our Earth. The land is whited out. You'll notice there's kind of these light blue areas that border the countries. Those are what are outlining what we consider the exclusive economic zones of those countries. So some of these resources do exist in national waters, but I'm not going to focus on this quite as much for this presentation. Then you have these other colors that represent different deposits. So I'll walk you through those one at a time. So the first kind of mineral resource on the seafloor are the hydrothermal sulfides. And so that's highlighted in this red color throughout this map. And you can see that those red dots align with where those mid-ocean ridges are. So those areas where ocean plates are pulling apart, you have these underwater volcanoes, lots of hydrothermal venting. And that's where you have the precipitation of what are called vent sulfides. So all that hot water, it's got a lot of metal in it. The hot water comes out into the bottom of the ocean, it gets cool, and those metals precipitate, and they form these chimney structures that can be, several dozens of feet tall in some cases. And again, these ecosystems, or these structures, also support unique animal ecosystems. So in this picture, you can kind of see like these lumpy things on the structures. Those are actually mussels that have adapted to the unique chemistry of these environments, and they're only found in places like this. They're not found elsewhere in the ocean. The next type of resource is what are called cobalt crusts, and those are highlighted in the orange color throughout this map. And so you can kind of see a lot of orange in the Western Pacific, and also some in the Indian Ocean. These are places where you have underwater mountains that poke out of the seafloor. Those mountains are generally made of basalt. And over long periods of time, rinds form on those rocks, and those rinds are really concentrated in some of these metals. And so those are some of the locations of those resources. And so here's a picture of what that kind of looks like. This is an image taken from a seamount off the coast of Costa Rica. And you can see the kind of bulbous looking rocks. Underneath those are basalt, and that black and brown color represents those crusts that have formed. So those crusts are really rich in some of these metals. You also see there's a lot of octopus in this image. I'm going to come back to that in a couple minutes. But just think about that. Cobalt crusts form on seamounts. The third type of mineral resource on our seafloor are what are called polymetallic nodules, or manganese nodules, or just nodules, depending on who you're talking to. Those are highlighted in this purple color. And you can see that they kind of are in kind of the middle areas of the ocean, not necessarily above a vent site, not necessarily really close to land. So what do these look like? If you were to go to the seafloor in an area with manganese nodules, it's generally like really flat seafloor where you have these potato-sized lumps. And these lumps form over hundreds of thousands of years, we think, very slowly, adding a layer, like microscopic layer after microscopic layer over long periods of time. And they cover the seafloor. And right now, this resource type is the one that's most actively being targeted, especially in international waters, because the technology one might use to extract these is relatively easy to design compared to trying to get the cobalt crust on seamounts, which requires something like dredging or working at sulfides, which require digging down into the seafloor. Okay, so the last color on this map that I want to highlight to you are what are called contracted areas. So these are highlighted in green. These are areas of international water that have already been set aside by a body that I'll talk about in a few minutes for exploring for the potential for deep sea mining. And so if you look over on the left-hand side, you see a lot of these green boxes. So there's many, many different nations that have one of these kind of exploration areas. And just for scale, right, that whole, the length of that area is almost the same length as the contiguous United States. So this is like a massive area of the seafloor that has already been divvied up for potential exploration. I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, so as I've said, there are people already interested in trying to get these deposits. And so here's a cartoon kind of representing what that might look like. So you have these three resource types. You have the vents, sulfides that form along mid-ocean ridges. And they could, there's not much interest in getting active vents. Kind of want to get them once they've stopped spewing out all this hot water, which might destroy your mining equipment. But it's actually very hard to determine where you have inactive and active sites in close proximity. Then you have these seamount environments that have these cobalt crusts, and then the manganese nodule fields. In all of these environments, the work that I do is to understand how microscopic life that lives on those hard substrates provides ecosystem services to the larger ocean system. So that might be things like, as I mentioned with the hydrothermal vents, microbes might be using some of the chemicals to grow, and therefore they form kind of the base of the food chain. They form, they generate primary production that other life can eat. They might play a role in nutrient cycling or taking up carbon dioxide and sequestering it in those environments, but we don't have a lot of data about this. There's not a lot of people studying this. And so to understand impacts, there's an urgent need to try to assess these things because there's a growing industry to try to do this kind of work. So what do we know so far about what these impacts might look like? So I want to show you here a couple images from a study that some colleagues of mine did that was published in Scientific Reports a few years back. So they had gone to an area of the seafloor that has these manganese nodules. And 35 or almost 40 years ago now, there had been some preliminary experiments done looking at how mining might impact ecosystems. So at that time, roughly 40 years ago, a kind of trial mining test was done to drag a dredge through the seafloor in an area of manganese nodules to see what the disturbance might be. And then the scientists went back to see how does the seafloor look. So in the top left corner, you see an image of kind of what happy and healthy manganese nodules fields look like, undisturbed manganese nodules. And you can see that there's some animals there. There's like a sea slug, there's some sponges, there's other life that is associated with these manganese nodules. In the upper right, you see an image of what seafloor that does not have a lot of manganese nodules on it, but that has not been disturbed, what it looks like. And hopefully you can see that there's kind of these wiggly trails in it. Those are indications of animals moving through that ecosystem. And then the image on the lower row that's highlighted in red shows what the seafloor looks like in an area that had been disturbed 35 years prior to the study. And essentially what the scientists found is that there had been no recovery of those ecosystems. So the animals had not returned either to the sediment or to the rocks in that environment. And so what that tells us is that within human timescales, these ecosystems, if they're disturbed, will not recover. Potentially, if we did some remediation, maybe they would recover, but there are very few studies about that. Very recently, colleagues of mine have also started to ask the question, well, okay, maybe animals take a while to come back, but maybe the microbes come back sooner. So this was a study that just came out a few weeks ago in Science Advances, where in a similar type of study, they looked at healthy seafloor that had not been impacted, which is represented in green in this image. They looked at seafloor that had been impacted 26 years prior to the study, so those are those yellow to orange colors, and then seafloor that had been impacted just a few weeks prior to when the samples were collected. And so kind of in a cartoon view, you can imagine the different types of seafloor structures. You have an undamaged seafloor that's got the rocks on it and it has microbes. You have damaged seafloor in the orange and red. And what the scientists did was looked at a couple different indicators of microbial life. And I'm just showing you one example of that in this image. They looked at what's called carbon CO2 fixation. So just like plants on land use the sunlight energy to convert carbon dioxide into organic matter and grow, and then we can eat them, microbes are doing that same thing, but instead of using energy from sun, they're using energy from chemical reactions. And so this is a measurement of how much new food is being created by microbes in these ecosystems. And what you can very clearly see in this image is that the ability for microbial communities to deliver this really important service in these ecosystems of generating food for animals to eat is severely impacted, even still decades after the impact has occurred. And so these are just a handful of data that have become available in the last few years, but there's a lot that we still don't know. And so colleagues of mine and I put together a white paper that came out earlier this year, trying to assess, like, what do we know and not know about microbes in these deep sea environments, and what type of services might be the most impacted. And so we looked at that at the 4 different types of mineral resources, from those vents to the cobalt crust and the manganese nodules, and tried to assess, like, is it a critical service? How well do we understand it? And how vulnerable is it to damage if deep sea impacts occur? But the main takeaway of that study was that there's not a lot of data. You can see a lot of these circles have kind of that dashed line, means that we don't understand it very well. And so more studies are needed. And just to give one example of what I mean by that, I want to show you another video. So hopefully this starts playing. A few years back, I had the chance to go in the Alvin submersible to a seamount off of Costa Rica. And we were trying to document low temperature fluid flow. And you can kind of see that in this video. It kind of looks like it's shimmering. That's hot water coming out of the seafloor. What we did not expect to find is a huge octopus nursery, and that the octopus use those little seeps of hot water to incubate their eggs, and they brood their eggs in these hot water. So you can see the egg sac that the octopus is protecting while we're doing a temperature measurement there. So this was a totally unknown animal behavior prior to us doing this study. Subsequently, other scientists have and researchers have found this association of octopus nurseries with sites that might have low temperature fluid flow. And so what this means is that, again, because we have such a poor understanding of the types, oops, that's not what I meant to do, the types of environments on our seafloor, there may be things that we're missing. As another example of the value of these ecosystems, at these hydrothermal vents and also at the cobalt crust environments, the microbes that live there are pretty unique compared to what you find on land. And that means that they also have really novel genetic resources that might benefit humanity in other ways. So already there are companies that have products like antibiotics, anti-cancer compounds. There are compounds that are made by these microbes or used as cosmeceuticals, as well as in industrial enzymes. And so if we were to destroy some of these environments, we might lose that genetic novelty that might also have a benefit for humanity. And I bring that up because when we think again about who manages this resource, especially in international waters, it gets complicated, right? So no country has jurisdiction over these international waters. The way that management of all of these resources works is through an agency, essentially, called the International Seabed Authority. And that was established as part of the United Nations, as part of the Convention on the Law of the Sea. And this agency sits within a large, alphabet soup of different programs within the United Nations. But this agency is what is the body that decides who can access international waters and the mineral resources within them. Okay, so another survey question for you quickly. Do you think the US is a member of the Convention on the Law of the Sea? So yes or no, do you think we are a member or do you think we're not a member? The answer is no. While we were definitely part of the conversation and the US was a signatory, the Senate never ratified our membership. And so we are not a member of the Convention of the Law of the Sea. What that means is that the US cannot request access to these resources, although our US-based companies could be involved as contractors with other states. Why is this important? The International Seabed Authority, its mandate as part of the Convention on the Law of the Sea, is that all of those resources on the deep sea should be considered the common heritage of all of mankind on Earth, and it has to be managed in the interest of mankind. And so I see my role as a scientist is to help advise the International Seabed Authority on what is the best science about the value of these ecosystems. And what are the other values of these resources besides just their mineral value? And so I do this through programs like the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, which is a official observer at the International Seabed Authority. And I use a picture here of my colleague, Diva Aman, who is a scientist, a Trinidadian scientist who is currently the head of our working group and represents us at this body. Okay, so let's move away from some of the legal stuff and just think about like, what is the scale of this? Like, why should I care about this? Okay, already 2 million square kilometers of our seafloor has already been contracted for exploration for deep sea mining. So those were those green boxes I showed you in those maps. So it doesn't mean that 2 million square kilometers are going to be mined. It means that states have rights to explore those areas and to assess the mineral, economic content of the resources there. And then they could put in an application to try to exploit that resource as a fraction of the area that they've explored. But just for context, let's think about that 2 million square kilometers. How does that compare to other impacts on the bottom of the ocean? So every year, about 1 million square kilometers of the seafloor is impacted by bottom trawling. So the area that's already contracted for potential deep sea mining is 2 times greater than all of the area that we probably impact for bottom trawling. It's also 5 times greater than all of the area of mines and quarries on land, which have their own environmental impacts. And then as another example, another impact on the seafloor are seabed cables, which is where the majority of our internet traffic is moving through. That only, so deep sea mining could be, like 1,500 times greater than that potential impact. Okay, now you might be asking yourself, like, what does any of this have to do with Maine? Because if you remember that map, none of those resources are in the Gulf of Maine. But to me, the connection comes in the conversations that are happening right now in our state about trying to move to carbon neutrality. So many of you may be familiar with the Maine Climate Council, which is exploring ways that Maine could satisfy Governor Mills's push to try to get us to be carbon neutral by 2045, which would essentially represent big reductions in our carbon emissions. And so as an example goal of that, within the next 10 years, there's a desire that 80% of the electrical needs for our state would come from renewable sources. Now, if you remember back to earlier in my talk, that means that Maine would need all of these things that require lots more metal. And so using current technologies. So if we want more wind turbines, if we want more solar panels, if we want more electric vehicles, there's going to be an increasing demand for metals. And it's important that we have these conversations because Maine is definitely feeling the impacts of the increased carbon emissions that are going into our atmosphere. So this is an image that came from one of the technical working groups looking at climate impacts in Maine and projecting how much warmer it might get in Maine over the next few decades, with this idea that Maine's temperature might be more similar to what we have in Rhode Island. And it's not just that it's getting warmer, right? Another impact of warming is that the sea levels are rising. And this is especially problematic when we have storm surges, right? So here's an image from Vinyl Haven that I borrowed from the Island Institute showing an example of this impact. And the idea that this impact will increase as waters warm. Another consequence of water warming is that our lobster fishery could be in jeopardy because lobsters don't necessarily like warmer waters, and they will continue to migrate north to find cooler waters. And since the lobster fishery is such a large fraction of Maine's fishing industry, this could have major impacts for many Mainers if our waters continue to warm. And if we think about what are the biggest sources of emissions in Maine and how can we try to prevent this, here's some data that I collected as part of looking into the Maine Climate Council of where are our carbon emissions coming from. And the majority of our emissions come from transportation and from heating, right? Maine's a rural state. We drive around a lot to get places. We use a lot of heating oil in our homes to keep us warm. And so that's really those biggest sections of where our energy consumption comes from. So my last little question for you to think about is Maine, so within the United States, does Maine have the highest dependence on heating oil? So do you think that's yes, or do you think there's another state that's more dependent on heating oil than us? And the answer is yes, we are. Maine is one of our biggest contributors to our emissions, is that so many of our homes are dependent on heating oil. Okay, so kind of wrap this up. I don't want to bum you out too much, right? Because we do want to move to this fossil-free future, but we just need to do it mindfully. So I'm not trying to say like, don't buy electric vehicles, but let's think about how we can do this in the best way for the benefit of our planet. And so if you want to know more about this, I encourage all of you to go to the website for the Climate Council. I will put in a disclaimer here that I am in no way affiliated with this. I am not on the council. I have not been asked about it. I just find it interesting as a citizen of Maine. And so if you go to this website, you can participate and share your thoughts. And one of the things I would like to encourage you to do if you do engage with this is think about, again, if we want to have these technologies to lead us towards a fossil-free future, and we need these types of batteries, well, how can we do this and not need to go mine the seafloor? One way to do that is if we had better battery recycling. So right now, the largest source of a lot of these metals that I talked about is actually in our landfills. We are not doing a very good job of recycling these metals. And so as consumers, we can really push to try to have better recycling programs so that we're not recreating that problem. And we can also encourage research and development to actually generate better lithium-ion battery chemistry so that we don't need as many of these metals. So those are two different ways that we can try to limit the metal demand, but also still promote these technologies. And so as a consumer, if you have electronics, please do not throw them away into the landfill or bring them to your transfer station as trash, but try to use programs that do electronics recycling. And in Maine, one of the ways you can do that is a program called Call to Recycle, which will help you find places where you can bring your electronics for actual recycling of those metals. So I know I'm at my time limit here, so I'll try to close it up quickly and leave you again with this image of the fact that we discovered this new animal behavior on the seafloor that we weren't even looking for at one of these resource types. And so until we understand these ecosystems, we won't really understand the impacts that might be associated with this emerging industry. If you'd like to know more about my research or follow what I do, and if you use Twitter, you can find me at Deep Microbe. You're welcome to engage with me there if you like. And with that, I'll wrap up. I'll encourage your questions, which you can submit through that Q&A button. And if you'd like to know more about the research we do at Bigelow, please check out our website. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so I can see everybody. If I can come back over here. Let's try to do it this way.
All right, Beth, thank you very, very much for a really informative presentation. And the thing that impressed me so much is how accessible you made this very complex subject. I felt as if I could follow right along with you, although I also could see there were many layers of complexity beneath what you were presenting. It certainly fills one with a sense of urgency to become better informed about these subjects. So we've got some time for questions, and I'm going to give your introducer, Peter Rothschild, an opportunity to ask a first question, if you would, Peter.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So I just wondered, what is your prognosis for international agreements that would limit the impacts of, it seems like, you know, quite our administration aside, the world is not very well, hasn't come up with ways of truly developing international agreements that protect the environment. And what do you think is the prognosis for the UN or anybody else to control mining in the deep sea?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Peter. There's kind of a couple different aspects of answering that I want to touch on. So in my talk, I actually mostly talked about international waters and how the International Seabed Authority is considering how they might manage mining in that area. And you know, those conversations are advancing rapidly. They meet twice a year, and the commissions are trying to come up with the mining code in those international waters. And there is definitely a push from some states and some contractors to try to get that moving faster. There are also many countries that are part of this process that are urging, let's slow down and make sure we do this correctly. Unlike many industries, we have the luxury of trying to do it correctly instead of trying to figure out how to fix it at the end. And so trying to encourage a more precautionary approach. But for countries that are trying to promote this, for example, many island nations that don't have a lot of resources on their own land see this as a way to access resources that would be of benefit to their citizens. And so they are trying to promote that. And so really those conversations at the International Seabed Authority and in trade magazines are the ways that we're trying to raise awareness about that. I did not mention that there are several nations that are already exploring for this in a much more accelerated rate in their national waters, because they have the luxury of being able to create a legal framework for their own exclusive economic zone of how they might use those resources. The United States is actually, within the last few years, there have been several executive orders mandating our federal agencies to work together to better understand the mineral resources in our own waters, especially on the Pacific coast, as well as the Alaskan area. And so many federal agencies are trying to better characterize our own exclusive economic zone and whether we have resources that we could tap into, especially since we're not part of the Convention on the Law of the Sea. So to come back to your question, I definitely feel that there's a lot of urgency to this. It has really accelerated in the last few years, and so I try to spend quite a bit of my time engaging in those conversations and providing kind of expert opinion on what we know, what we don't know, and what we would need to monitor to see if there are impacts.
Thanks.
Okay, we have some more questions for you, Beth. Thomas Bayer says, I have heard that seabed mining leases have been allocated and are currently being mined. Is that correct?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So in international waters, yes, there are leases that states and contractors have, but those leases are just to explore. And they can maybe do what's called test mining. So test out whether the new machines that they're designing will work in a relatively prescribed area. So it's not like they're going over their whole lease block. Right now, there is no established mining code for any of those states to be able to economically mine those lease blocks. They would have to put in a separate request to get permission to exploit the resource in international waters. Again, in territorial waters of various countries, there are companies working with those states to potentially mine. So Papua New Guinea is an example. There's been several years of collaboration with the country to potentially mine in their waters. The Cook Islands is also working with companies about exploring resources in their area. So there's not much actual mining happening, but there is several states and contractors working to get to that level. I hope I answered that question.
All right, thank you. Now we have a slightly different topic. Has to do with octopi. Those egg sacs of the octopi are huge. How many eggs are in a sac? And that question comes from Kathy Kerr.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So it looks like they're really big in that video because we were really zoomed in. Each one of those octopus, their head, right, is probably about as big as my fist or a little bit smaller. And so their egg sacs, or the cluster of eggs, there's maybe like a couple dozen sacs, and each one probably only has one octopus that would grow in it. In a lot of the imagery, we actually don't see a lot of baby octopus in the egg sacs, but that might just be when we were actually there, that maybe those egg sacs were relatively new and the octopus had not grown yet. And that's just because we've only been there twice, both at the same time of year. So we would need to go back at a different time and figure out how many actual octopus are in there.
A question to answer on your next trip.
Yes.
We have a question from Todd Seekman. He says, I know that it takes many years for detritus to settle to the abyssal plain. Does this explain the lack of new microbes on the floor after 35 years? Or do you feel that there are other reasons beyond that?
Yeah, that's a very intuitive reason for why the impacts are so long-lived in those areas. So you're correct that the areas that manganese nodules form in are in these areas that are far away from land, far away from these hydrothermal vent systems, which means there's not a lot of nutrients in the water, and there's not a lot of detritus raining down. There's not a lot of plankton living in the water. There's not a lot of fish. And so things are settling very, very slowly. And so there's no new inputs to reset the system. So if you were to take some of that sediment underneath a manganese nodule and just go down about an inch, you would be in sediments that were tens of thousands of years older than at the seafloor. And so it definitely is it seems that it's taking the microbial ecosystem a while to recover because there's not a lot of food coming down.
All right, thank you. We've got a couple more questions popping up from Jan Lupton. She asks, is there an advantage to the Congress to vote to join the international group? What would that require if they haven't acted to date?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I will say that I'm definitely not an expert in kind of the legal aspects of the Convention of the Law of the Sea. There are pros and cons in both directions, and that's part of the reason that the Senate did not choose to ratify this decades ago when the convention was first discussed, in the sense that by joining the Convention of the Law of the Sea, there's thought that it can limit some of the activities that the US might be able to do because it's part of then a treaty. But at the same time, because we're not a member of the convention, we as a country do not have access to request the use of these mineral resources and justify how they would benefit mankind. And so our country doesn't necessarily benefit, is left out of that conversation in terms of potentially applying to use those resources. That's just one example. There are other potential impacts for not being a member of the convention. I believe that the Senate could choose to pick this back up and decide to ratify it and become a member, but that would take a lot of political initiative to try to get bipartisan support for this idea. And I don't know that now is the time that that is going to happen. But that, I think, is what would be required. And I think that's part of, again, the motivation for why, at least in our country, there's been this promotion through the executive order function of the executive branch of our government to try to promote resource characterization in our national waters in recognition that we don't have access to the international waters.
All right, we have a related question from Sue Stafford. She asks, why isn't the US a part of the international body? She says she can't remember the name. Are you speaking of the Convention on the Law of the Sea or of the International Seabed Authority that is controlling the leases? And when was that body created?
Yeah, and again, I'll profess my somewhat ignorance on the technical aspects of this. So because the US did not sign or did not ratify our signature to the Convention of the Law of the Sea, that was back in, I believe, the 80s that conversation initiated. The International Seabed Authority aspects were more described in the 90s. And so again, as a country, we are not part of the International Seabed Authority, although we do have observer status, but we can't benefit as a member of the Convention of the Law of the Sea. If folks want to ask more questions about that, I'm happy to look into it more and follow up with you offline, but that's definitely not my area of expertise.
Well, you can't know about everything, that's for sure. I think, one of the arguments against joining the convention at the time was that the US is obviously outvoted by the many, many members of the United Nations, many of whom have very little stake in or opportunity to exploit the resources that are there. That's often the argument that's used, that the voting system is stacked against the US.
Mhm.
But that is something that could obviously be addressed. And there's some wonderful literature on the theory of the commons. It's been very, very heavily researched and thought about. I mean, it gets into the philosophy of what the resources of our planet, to whom do they belong, and what our responsibility is. But that's a whole field that's quite fascinating to get into. All right, Peter, do you have another thought on?
No, not any other than Beth. This has just been wonderful, very, very informative. You know, I hope we will all have an opportunity to follow up with you, and you'll keep us posted on your progress, which sounds seminal and extremely important. Thank you.
Very much.
Yes, Beth, I certainly echo that. I recall you were encouraging people to go to climatecouncil.maine.gov if they wanted some more information. So again, I just am so impressed with how accessible you were able to make this very complex topic. And I know for one that I'm going to be reading all articles on this subject a lot more closely than I have in the past. So you've got a convert here.
Okay, great.
And now I would just like to say a quick word about our program for next week, our 6th program, August 16th. Our speaker is Dr. James Basker, who is director of the Gilder Lehrman Institute at the New York Historical Society. And his field of expertise takes us some distance away from the ocean into history, the history of slavery, a very timely topic, and he will bring us up to current time with discussion about Black Lives Mattering. In fact, the title of his talk is Black Lives Always Mattered. So we'll have an opportunity to hear his insights. And I want to mention one special feature. The program will be dedicated to the memory of Richard Gilder, a longtime resident of the island and major contributor in so many ways to island activities and institutions, as he was to the New York Historical Society and to the Gilder Lehrman Institute, which James Basker represents. We just lost Richard Gilder about 2 months ago, so that too is very timely, and I hope you will all think of joining us, especially because of the tribute it's paying to him and the timeliness of the topic. So I'll just close by saying once again, we hope you will help us go forward with the forum for 2021 by considering a contribution of some small amount to show your support. So with that, I will say good evening and thanks again, Beth Orcutt, for an absolutely wonderful, informative program.
Great, thanks, it was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.